Very excited to hear the latest results from Claude Swanson.
I'm delighted to be here. Okay. This is a very exciting field, exciting time to be a scientist, although right, most physicists are missing out on the excitement. Back this, I'm going to be back this. As you know, recently the Higgs boson was discovered and announced to the world. And of course in the main media, that's all presented as we fixed all the things, we have all the answers now. Physics has explained everything for us, and it all fits together. So you go back to sleep. No. And meanwhile, there are some pretty exciting developments happening around the world that are not being very well covered in the U.S. media. The device shown here is a Russian invention, the torsion generator that uses to send torsion signals. They go faster than light and they use it in communication and things like that. It's part of the technologies that we're not hearing much about in the West, but they seem to be very, very directly on what we know about energy healing, energy medicine. They're part of a whole other science that really needs to be known and understood. This is my background, as you just heard. I went to MIT Princeton, I went to work at the Gravity Group at Princeton. We worked on looking out into the universe, into the cosmos, developing new technology, and nobody was worried in those days about dark matter or dark energy. It was in the 70s, and nobody talked about it, no one was concerned about it. We have had a few discoveries since then. The standard model was developed in physics. My thesis advisor, one of the graduates, Steve Weinberg, who was one of the inventors of the standard model. One of the key pieces that was missing in those days was called the Higgs boson. As you probably heard, if you have not been asleep in the past several weeks, the Higgs boson lately has been discovered. Now they've got this huge collider on the border between France and Switzerland, 70 miles around, huge thing, lots and lots of money, banging particles together, very high speed, very high energy, and they believe that the Higgs boson kind of confirms the standard model of physics, which that tells them, okay, we knew it all along, we have it all figured out now. The problem is that what they've been looking at are things that operate at very short ranges, forces that operate at very small distances. So our basic physics is really dependent on two kinds of forces. These nuclear forces that operate at very short ranges, and electromagnetism and gravity that operate over medium ranges. They all get weaker the further away you go. And if you look at the scale of sizes of things you worry about in physics, you have a very, very big, like the universe, which in our present model is about 10 to the 26 meters across. That's 1 and 26 zeros. That's the number of meters across to the distant matter that we can see or that we think takes part in our universe. Down to the human scale is meters in size. The atom, which is 10 to the minus 10th meters in size, that's a point, decimal point, and then 9 zeros and a 1. So it's a whole lot smaller. And the nucleus is 5 powers of 10 smaller than that. The Higgs boson is a couple orders of magnitude smaller than that at the distance scale. And that's kind of the range of physics that people worry about in science. However, they believe the smallest scale that makes any sense to think about is called the Planck length. And that's another 10 to the 19th and the 20th orders of magnitude smaller than that. There's about another 20 zeros, 20 powers of 10. It's a whole lot smaller. they're not really worrying about all of that real estate, all those small phenomena that go on. They're kind of assuming you don't have to worry about it. When I was in grad school, I learned how to make calculations about things like this. And what they tell us is at very small scales, the energy becomes greater and greater and greater. The energy uncertainties become large, so the amount of energy becomes very big. And so one of the problems that people were facing when I was in grad school is if you want to make a calculation and you want to look at a small scale, the energies are enormous. So if you add up the energy, say, in a cubic centimeter of empty space, because of the uncertainties of energy, you get energies that are greater than the mass of the Earth. I mean, you get enough energy there to boil all the water in all the oceans around the world. This is where the whole free energy technology comes from, the belief that there's a lot of energy in these very small scales. But by and large, with the Higgs acceleration, we're not really worried about that stuff. I'm assuming, okay, I was told, just subtract that out and don't think about it and go on. And that's kind of been the attitude in physics ever since then. However, I think, as we're going to see today, that's probably the realm where subtle energy is really important. This is called the zero-point energy. It's the energy in the vacuum. It's the energy because of the fluctuations, the little flows of energy at very small scales. And that's where you have patterns of energy. Patterns that have effects that determine how fast time passes, how fast time goes forward. It determines length scales. And if you want to affect somebody, a person, you can change the dimensions of space and time and energy. You can do almost anything. That's really what we're kind of learning, that by manipulating these small scales is really kind of a key to solid energy medicine, etc. So physics has left out a few things, despite all the celebrations going on. One of the recent experiments that gave us a clue that something is being left out involves the sun. People were looking for a random event generator. We did an experiment yesterday with making the device go high, making the device go low, making the count rate of a random event generator that makes ones and zeros, see if we can affect it with consciousness. And as you know, lots of experiments have shown that we can affect it with consciousness. But one form of a random event generator is a Geiger counter. It detects radioactivity. Put it next to something that's decaying radioactively, and whether it decays in the next second or not is a random event. And so you count was it decay or not, a 1 or a 0. So you can use radioactive materials as random event generators. They're supposed to be random. Nothing's supposed to affect them. And the physicists discovered that actually there's a problem. They watch the counts, and the sun gives off a solar glare. It affects the random event generator. And you get more counts or less counts, depending. And the problem is they can't explain why. There's no mechanism that can figure out that makes sense in our current physics that can explain why these random event generators are affected by solar flares, but it's a real effect. Here's a couple of quotes. Stanford physicists and Purdue physicists have been looking at it, and the best guess is neutrinos, but no one can explain why neutrinos should have this effect. Plus, sometimes it affects things so quickly that it has to be traveling faster than light to have the effect. So this is disturbing, but you probably won't hear about that for a certain amount of time. I'm sweeping under the rug. But this is the kind of thing that is going on with clues in mainstream physics all the time. One of the problems right now with our physics is that we have this wonderful theory for matter, but matter only constitutes a very small fraction of the universe. Most of the fraction we understand, and all the experiments that we've done about like the Higgs boson experiment, all the big atom experiments, is the little wedge you see there. 3.6% and 44%, those are the matters that we understand, the particles that are in our table. Everything else is something we don't understand. There's something called dark matter, which causes gravity, but is apparently not a known form of matter. And there's something else called dark energy, which actually pushes things away, it repels. And that's even a bigger part of the universe. And that also does not correspond to the form of matter we understand. So, if you map the dark matter in the universe, you find that it's sort of distributed throughout the universe. It's typically the red here are visible star systems that are radiating. The blue is the conventional matter. The red is the computed dark matter. So it's all through the universe. It's a pretty big problem. We don't have a theory for it. If you start looking for other problems in mainstream physics, you find them. Alan Mark is a very distinguished astronomer. He has several galaxies named after him. He was a protege of Hubble. According to Hubble, the expansion of the universe was named. But he has angered a number of astronomers because he keeps pointing out things that don't fit. And, for example, astronomers know that the universe is expanding. We have this way of measuring how far away things are from us, how far away they appear to be moving. It's called redshift. It's the only way we know how far things are away from us. But Hart keeps noting that when you use that scale to come up with contradictions, here's a picture of a galaxy that's relatively nearby, and there are few bright objects attached to it by clouds of dust, and yet by the calculations of redshift, they should be at the far edges of the universe. They should be, created. And when things first started out, the whole picture doesn't fit together. He wrote a book called Seeing Red about how he feels about this whole controversy, because when he writes papers about these things, they don't let him publish them in the main astronomy journals anymore. If you look at what happens to our best theory of physics called the gravity theory, Einstein's gravitational theory, and you're watching something called a pendulum, just swinging back and forth, it behaves according to the laws of gravity most of the time. But every so often, physicists see it veers off. It goes off to one side or the other, so it's swinging in a straight line. And that happens when there are solar eclipses. And it's not supposed to do that according to our theory of gravity. This has been seen by 3 different groups. By and large, it's been ignored by mainstream physics, but it's a signal that our physics theories are not complete and they're missing something important. Many of these effects can be explained by the force I'll talk about today, the life force or torsion, which has been pioneered in Russia primarily. It appears to be also the same thing as subtle energy, which is the key to energy medicine. It also appears to explain consciousness effects that also fit into Western physics. In the early days of the 20th century, people were first looking into atomic effects, the whole theory of the quantum. And they found out that if you make a measurement, an observation, it causes something called a wave function collapse. They describe particles at the quantum level as something called a wave function. It's a probability curve that tells you the probability of seeing a particle here or there. And it behaves pretty nicely, except when you look at it. If you look at it, then it causes that whole thing to break down and drop into one of the states that is available. You kind of start over again. Bohr and Einstein had big debates about this 100 years ago. And so if that's really true, then you think that consciousness must really be important. Because if our consciousness can affect physical experiments, then you'd think physicists would be studying consciousness like crazy for the last 100 years. But instead, it's very hard to publish papers in the mainstream physics journals on consciousness. More recently, we're starting to see effects that are so big and so important that it's becoming harder to ignore them. And that all comes back to energy medicine. I first began waking up to this subject well after graduate school. No one I knew I was worried about this stuff in grad school, but I began hearing about something called remote viewing. And as you sure know by now, Pat Price and a bunch of other very gifted people in the early 70s, under the direction of Hal Fugolf and some other scientists, began doing experiments to see if you sit in a light trance in a room somewhere, all the doors are closed, isolated, no signals in and out, and just given a set of numbers or a target inside the envelope, and ask them to start telling you about the object that you're referring to. They found that you could. An awful lot of people are able to do this, especially with the protocol they developed. One of the first targets that Pat Price did that got attracted support for the program from the CIA, which they were trying to attract, was the following. The target was like a set of coordinates. And Pat Price, at the beginning during the session, says, I feel like I'm on top of a building with the 3rd Avenue L over my head. I'm seeing these rails over the head of the building. And he begins drawing it. And he saw this big gantry crane that was huge. It was 2 or 3 stories high. And it ran, as you see in the lower drawing there, on railroad tracks. And then he began describing everything else in the session. It was a laboratory that involved some very strange equipment. How could I kind of figure out, well, we blew that, it can't be real, this stuff I never saw before. Turns out it was a secret Russian laboratory developing anti-missile defense system, SDI, and had 60-foot diameter spheres that were welded together. Very unusual thing. So much detail, that's really got the program started. As you probably know, nowadays anybody can sign up for a course in reviewing. I did, and I took 3 of them at Farsight in Atlanta with Corporal Brown, and I thought I could do it as well, which is kind of amazing. Not as well as they could do it, but still, you get enough success to convince you that the mind is not limited by space and time. This is we basically give it 8 numbers. It refers to a target that's described somewhere else in some envelope. This is a particular one of, it turned out to be the destruction of Pompeii. What I was seeing were Roman soldiers, some kind of barricade they were building, a light in the distance and dark clouds. And what I felt was exodus, Red Sea, flurry of activity, crowd, urgency, many animals, confusion, fear, and then I got destruction of Pompeii. And that's kind of typical of a lot of remote viewing sessions. What you find is that it doesn't depend on how long ago the event occurred. One of my targets was destruction of dinosaurs, and I got that. I mean, it's very strange when you're experiencing something that happened a long time ago. You don't even oftentimes know where you are when it's happening. But what we're finding is that these effects don't depend on distance or time. As you probably know, the Princeton Pear Lab and other groups have done a lot of research over the years on subjects like this to see how good we can be. Yesterday we did an experiment here with random generators, as I mentioned, trying to affect them. They can go high or they can go low. This is a typical graph from some of the Princeton data. The red line, we're trying to make the guys get more ones. And over time, it gets higher and higher numbers. Making it go low, you get the blue graph at the bottom, you get the more and more zeros, or minus ones, as the case may be. So the mind can affect these things. ESP, or psychic communication, they find that works in much the same way. Typically, the Princeton experiments were using average people. They were not picking the best of the best, which the military remote viewing program was. So these were volunteers. And so on the average, the data looks almost like a Gaussian curve. You've got to get about as many right answers as you do wrong answers. And so they get a Gaussian curve, except that they found that their Gaussian had a hump, and a hump on the upper side. They got more rights than wrongs. And when you subtract that out from the pure random result, there's a little red curve on the bottom, and that's the residue of somebody's picking up a true signal. And if you do this enough, the odds of that occurring can become overwhelming. At the present time, the Princeton data is trillions to 1 against chance, which means it's overwhelmingly likely, if you want to call it that. It's a very real force. We all have this ability, and it definitely exists. Robert John, who was in the engineering department at Princeton when I was there, who ran this program, concluded all forces known to physics, like gravity, for example, diminish with distance. And no force in physics operates freely across time like this. It's as if consciousness is somehow able to direct its influence directly across space and time. An understanding that certainly poses a challenge for science. Lloyd, in the 70s, did experiments on people to see how widespread its abilities are. He found that if you put someone in a chamber and wire them up, wire up their brainwaves to measure EEGs, and then send them a psychic message, they respond as though they're picking up the message. Their brainwaves show a change when you send them a psychic message. Even though consciously, most of them are unaware that they received the message, but subconsciously, the brainwaves show that they did. So we all probably have the same basic machinery to receive psychic messages. Most of us are not trained to quiet our left brain, our shattering analytical mind is always in there saying stuff. If we learn how to get quiet and listen, we probably have a lot more ability in this area. As you know, Steve Baxter did wonderful experiments with plants around the same time period. He discovered that plants are psychic too. He ran a polygraph training company in New York, and one night he was working too late, and he thought his plant needed some water, so he said, I wonder what would happen if I wired up my polygraph machine to the plant. So he did, and he thought the polygraph trace didn't look the way he thought it would. It looked almost like a human trace. He thought he saw emotional variation in it. So he did the next thing, which polygraph operators are trained to do, put your client under stress. So the thought occurred, what would happen if I burned its leaf? He hadn't made a move to do anything, but the plant went crazy. The plant knew what he was thinking and didn't like it. So that started a 30-year program of research on the psychic ability of plants. He had plants wired up in his house. He found that when you kill something, in this case putting shrimp into boiling water, the plant is empathic and responds with a wild variation on the trace. He found that one day he was breaking a live egg to put it in his dog's food bowl, and as he did, the plant reacted. So he discovered the plants are empathic. There are other experiments that have been done with animals and with human saliva, even our T cells and our saliva, that discovers the widespread effect, the ability of cells to communicate with themselves. And this works even with Faraday cages and other shielding to rule out conventional forms of electromagnetic signaling. It still works. So there's one more example that resists the force. It's not part of conventional physics. It doesn't seem to weaken with distance. It operates across time and space, as the Princeton group found. When many people think together, they have a conscious thought together, this could be magnified. Group consciousness, we meditated together for thousands of years. During 9/11, as you've probably seen this data, at that point there was no random event generators in a network around the world. And when that event happened, people turned by the millions of the TV sets and they all took part in this event. When the results were tabulated in these random event generators, they found that they did not behave randomly. They acted more like they were coupled together. And the correlation between them was far higher than by chance. This seems to occur whenever there's a mass consciousness event, when many people are thinking the same thought. It affects space and time in a way that can be measured by the REGs. One application of that is synchronized prayer. If we can, we're in 2012, we're already seeing some strange events happen, some very strange weather. I'm in Colorado, we had some tragic events the last couple of days in Denver at the theater. We're seeing some bizarre effects as well as some strange weather effects. As time goes on, it may be very important for us to use our tools of consciousness to help the planet, to help Most of us here have some experience with healing. The planet needs healing. Everyone around the world probably needs some healing. So one way that we try to synchronize our prayers and good thoughts to maximize the power of our ability to do this. One set of data that we're seeing is the little blue line here shows how the random event generators around the world behave when there is no consciousness process going on. It gives more or less a random low value. When people synchronize their prayers, you get these large red curves, very large excursions, which says that our conscious intentions are affecting the behavior of random processes, which are quantum processes all around the world. So prayers have effect. And on my website, I run a global peace prayer, which I explain on the website. They're using some of these technologies to try to help with the peace of the planet. Other things that have been discovered from this research, we know the future. We're connected to events in the future. There's some engravings data here showing that several seconds before people are shown an image, their body begins to react appropriately to prepare. On that level, their body knows what's coming, even if it hasn't been decided by a random event generator. It's still, we know we're connected with future events. During remote viewing experiments, some people have observed a strange phenomenon that does not appear by Western science. It's an energy form that we can't really explain. The Chinese did experiments with remote viewers looking at an envelope in which there was a Chinese character drawn on a piece of paper. Next to it was a piece of blank photographic film. And what they found is that when the remote viewer was able to accurately tell what Chinese characters in the envelope, the piece of film became exposed. It became exposed and printed with the image of the character. So that this happened hundreds of feet away from the remote viewer. How did it happen that the image got printed on the film? The only explanation was there's some energy form that's present when we are doing remote viewing, when we're consciously, with our out-of-body mind, looking at something. Something is present at the site of the target that causes this imprint to happen. How put off and covered, we're aware of these experiments in China and duplicated in America using a total multiplier tube instead of a photographic film. But again, at the target, they ask the remote viewer, hey, go look at this target, tell us what is there in your mind. And when they were successful, there were pulses of light observed at the target that could not be explained. They correlated with the presence of consciousness at the target, which means that our out-of-body consciousness is something real. It's not just your imagination that you're actually there at the target. There's some energetic form that's there, and that it sets off detectors that can be detected in various ways. Alex Canhouse was a remote viewer in New York around the same time period, where he was Carlos Osis, who arranged a box in which the scenes kept changing over time. He asked Canhouse to go out of body, strapped down to a chair at the instrumentation, but he asked Canhouse to describe what he saw in the scene. When he was correct in his observations, Osis found all kinds of disturbances, magnetic, strain gauges with aluminum foil hanging down, and magnetic detectors, light detectors, things like that. He got anomalies. There's some energetic form that was present when Canhouse was successfully out of body looking at the scene. So this tells us there's a form of energy that can pass through barriers that is associated with consciousness, and this doesn't really fit any of the model we can explain, like the magnetism or the forces we know of in conventional physics. As we'll see, we can explain a lot of this with the Russian scientific torsion, and these forms of energy appear to correspond to that. It's probably the answer to what these astral forms are made of. I've been doing research on this area for about 20 years. It's fascinating when we have the chance to look at some new force, what seems to be a new force. That's my second book, Life Force. Got 700 and some pages, thousands of references, big book. One of the difficulties with understanding this energy is that it appears in so many forms. This is another cartoon depiction of some energy or torsion. It affects virtually every physical phenomenon. Not very strongly, but so here are the 6 blind scientists looking at the elephant, trying to figure out what they're looking at. Each one sees a different part of it. And it's the problem when you go back in the history of science and look for previous research in this area. And I do that in my book. You find that the Chinese have known about this energy for a very long time. They call it qi. It's the basis of Chinese medicine. And this is Huang Yi, the Yellow Emperor, who codified it. A modern Qigong master who learns to manipulate this energy and use it for healing, Master Hong Liu wrote a book, The Fundamental Life Force That Permeates All Things. Qi connects and animates everything in the universe. When the flow of qi is impaired, we have disease. When it flows easily, we have perfect health. He says, without a doubt, America needs Qigong. And if you look at some of the Chinese data, the Chinese scientists have been investigating Qigong in the last few decades, and some of this data has become available in the West. Here are typical results from some parameters of health. One particular case, blood sugar, weight, blood pressure, and sleep patterns. For one person being treated with Qigong. This is I have references in my book and lots more data there, but they used Qigong to treat cancer, to slow cancer cell growth. Here is inhibitory effects on liver cancer from 3,000 miles away. The other remarkable thing about Qigong is it doesn't care about distance. Oftentimes, Qigong masters operate remotely with their clients. Master Hong Liu, in the book I quoted a few minutes ago, talks about studying with his master, who lived and worked in a cave in southern China. He didn't make house calls. He stayed in the cave all the time. He would get the messages telepathically. He would work at a distance all the time. It was remarkable. We start reading about some of these folks. But this is not unusual among Qigong masters. One of the questions trying to understand this from a Western point of view is what makes it possible for them to do this? This is a force we don't recognize in Western physics. When does it occur? How do they produce it? One of the keys appears to be the breathing pattern that the Hindus call pranayama. So when we're breathing, you build up a concentration of this energy in the body, and that building up of the chi or the prana seems to be one key to be able to do these things. It's often used in martial arts in China. Here's a Qigong martial artist, a bunch of kids from a school learning this stuff, and the fellow on the right is using the chi to brace his body to protect himself, and his co-workers are attacking him with a pole, trying to knock him down. And it's often been used historically, and you find this not just in China, but many other places as well, in martial arts as a form of actually projecting the energy. When I first talked to a Western Qigong expert, he claimed this could not be done. You couldn't just send this stuff through the air. But this is Master Paul Dong on the left, a Qigong master who's also written several books about Qigong. One of his books is called Empty Force, about this particular skill. There are lots of examples in there of masters who do this quite regularly. Here he's knocking down one of the students through a door. But one of the greatest masters of this energy form is Dr. Yan Qing, who was discovered in China in the, early to mid-1980s as a young boy. He had a tremendous talent for this art. physicists in China began studying him. They took him to the National Physics Institute and began doing experiments. In this particular graph, he's actually giving a lecture in a hall about projecting chi. And around the room, there are lithium fluoride detectors of two different types. The students discovered that lithium fluoride is normally used in particle physics experiments. Give off a little bit of light when the chi hits it. And they can calculate measurement of the count. And so their data is represented by the horizontal blue line about the weights of the little figure there. That's the background level. And then when Master Yao-Jin is sending the chi, you get two different graphs of red and line based on the two different types of detectors he's using, about 20 times background level and more to the right than to the left. But very real effects in sending this energy. They did other experiments with him to see what other things he could do besides that. Here with the radioactive decay experiment with apparition, there are two kinds of detectors again to measure the count rate. And in Western physics, we think that radioactive decay rate is a fixed quantity. You just measure it and nothing really can change too much. But they would ask the master to either increase the rate or decrease it. And he could, by several percent, on command. Also, it didn't matter how far away he went from the experiment. In this case, he's just 1,900 kilometers away. And again, he can increase or decrease the decay rate on command. In fact, the Chinese physicists who were charged with writing up these results and publishing them were afraid to do so, because they said that people will think we're crazy because everyone knows this is impossible. They did luckily publish this excellent book by Dr. Liu, who ran these experiments about these various cases I'm describing here. Another experiment with Dr. Yang shows us effect on water with Raman spectroscopy. You get changes in the water structure, the vibration structure of the water molecule that lasts a couple of hours. It decays slowly over time. And so this is a quantitative physical effect that you can measure that shows that chi is causing a real effect. He also affected laser beams 2,000 kilometers away. One of the great scientists in with both Chinese and American heritage in recent years is Dr. Qian Yushen. I apologize for my pronunciation. He was famous in America with our rocket program. When he went back to China in the 1980s, he made the cover of Time magazine, and quite a famous person. He was author of Engineering Cybernetics, listed in Wikipedia as one of the founders of the Propulsion Lab at Caltech. He was named Person of the Year and named the 8th year for Deep Space Technology. So a world-class scientist. He read these studies and concluded these experimental results by Dr. Yang-Chun's co-workers were first in the world. They unequivocally demonstrated that without touching substances, the human body can affect them and change their molecular structures and properties. There were new scientific discoveries and a prelude to a scientific revolution. So this is a new force, and it is a prelude to a scientific revolution. Other Qigong masters, like Master Jason Lee, done experiments with Penn State, directed his Qi over 2,000 miles away to a lab run by John Neely, Penn State Hershey, and here's some data, growth rates of cancer cells in petri dishes. And when he directs his Qi to the cells, those cells die. The growth rates are shown in the lower curves that are bending over. The control petri dishes, which are only 2 inches away, keep on growing as normal. Joey Jones, as it's already been mentioned here, I think, as you well know, did wonderful experiments over the last 10 years with what's called quantum healing, another form of energy healing, and he found that you could make dramatic changes in the survival of HeLa cells by sending this energy. Here is survival rate of 24 hours of exposure to killing with radiation, he was able to increase the survival rate from 50% up to 70% by sending healing energy after being irradiated with gamma rays. The survival rate when you send the healing energy before irradiating, 80%. Before and after, 88%. And then his real stroke of genius, he was bothered by it because he felt it should be 100%. It was only 88% after many years. And one day the idea occurred to him, maybe it's the karma of the cells that's limiting their access to healing. So the next experiment, he had an assistant at a telephone called charity with the intention that a good gift, the good karma from the gift would go to the cells. And it went from 88% to 96%. So remarkable results. Is that the right time? How much time do we have? Is that the right time there?
You have to do 2.
I'm sorry?
You have until, I think 2. Yes, you have until 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock, okay.
And it's 1.
I was going to do a time warp there, I'm sorry. See how fast I can talk. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the different aspects of this type of energy because it shows up in so many different ways. It's used in energy medicine, but it has many other uses besides that, and it appears it changes physical phenomena in so many ways. In the West, we're more recently learning about this energy. It's not part of ancient tradition in the West, but in Germany in the 1840s, Karl von Reichenbach, who was a brilliant chemist and a successful industrialist, began investigating this energy. He found that people can often see this energy when you give them time to adapt their eyes to darkness. The ones who are best able to do this are called the high sensitives. And I've done experiments along these lines to replicate some of the simple experiments and found out how to do it. I'm going to skip over a little bit of this, but basically the people who do have this ability, who are the high sensitives, they produce energy which you can see in the dark. And crystals also produce this energy when the tips of the crystals and magnets as well. One of his tests for whether you are a high sensitive or not is a credit card test. You hold a credit card on the tips of your fingers and imagine energy flowing up through your arm. And if you're a high sensitive, the card will rotate. One of the tricks here is you have to take all the metal off your body. But I actually did this with, I don't think I'm a high sensitive, I took all the metal off my body. And there's one other trick we use to help this happen. According to von Reichenbach's research, the body is polarized in terms of the chi. The right side and the left side have different polarities, different energy polarity. And there are certain materials that have more of one or the other polarity of energy. So you can take, for example, I did charcoal briquettes, which is charged with one of the polarities. It's this what you call negative O, and that actually increases the flow in the right hand. I was able to get the card to go halfway around on 2 different tries out of 3. So I tend to think there's something to all this. These are reports from some of the high sensitives, what they saw in the dark when magnets or strong magnets are operating. They see a light coming from the tips of the magnets. It acts somewhat like smoke. If you put water next to the magnet, the water changes its flavor after a while. And the two polarities, the two ends of the magnet, have a different effect on the water. He also discovered that friction and other chemical processes produce this energy, and the high sensitives would see a light present when this energy was being created. He found that in his periodic table of elements, he found that the elements on the right-hand side, fluorine, oxygen on the right-hand side of the periodic table, have a certain color. They're owed negative or blue, bluish light. They felt cool. The table on the left-hand side, the metals, have a warmer feeling to them. So there's a whole system of physics behind these apparent differences in materials. The reason this is important is because the Russian torsion experiments that have been done over the last 50 years confirm a lot of his observations independently. And because the Russian work is not fully published or fully available, I wanted to be able to compare that with research. Wilhelm Reich discovered this energy again. He called it orgone. His experiments also back up the observations of the people that are talking about here. He developed a box called the orgone accumulator that would build up the concentration of his energy, and when he did, physical effects could be observed in the box. It also affected radioactive decay, which is one of the things the Russians also report with this energy. Bill Taylor, we were talking yesterday, has reported filled rooms where he builds up concentrations of what appears to be the same energy with his IIPDs. He gets changes in physical phenomena that appear to be very similar to what we're talking about here. This is one of Taylor's experiments where he's changing the pH of water. And from his data, where he sees changing the pH, and then after a while it goes back, but these are things that should not be happening by Western physics. It shouldn't be possible to change the pH of water in this way. And the other type of effect that Taylor talked about yesterday is that sometimes in his experiments, you'll see these oscillations of properties like the temperature in the air, for example, that you can't explain by our Western physics today. You can put a fan below it to disturb the air and make sure there was no periodic circulation effects that were causing this, and the effect continued. So, again, we're seeing strange phenomena that are telling us there's a new force here that's not a part of our Western science. When you take a box like one of Taylor's baths of water, where he's changing the gauge by building up some energy in the container, or you take one of Wright's orgone accumulators, where he's built up orgone in the container, people start seeing other effects around the container. They find these rings, certainly the rings outside of the container where the temperature is changing, where other things are changing in a way that you can't really explain by Western science. The magnetic fields often go through fluctuations, etc. The interesting thing is that if you go to a crop circle or to a stone circle in England, you often find a similar effect. This is the roll-like circle in England, and if you're a dowser and you start walking toward the center of the pattern, you'll find your dowsing rods cross periodically as you approach the center of the circle. This has been found to be another indicator of the presence of solar energy. Roger Taylor in England has shown that you can actually measure how much solar energy is present by watching dowsing rods cross. So again, one more independent way of confirming that these energies are really there. This is one of Roger's data using concentration warmness, or it's a form of solar energy material that has strong solar energy charge. The more he puts in his container in the middle and goes toward it with his dowsing rods, the more the path, the wavelength of the crossing pattern changes as he walks toward it. So you can actually quantify this effect. So these are all kind of preliminaries. I mean, to me, the most exciting work in the past 50 years is the Russian torsion work. The scientists involved really admit and believe this is the force that's responsible for psychic phenomena. Ivan Shakharanov, one of the Russian torsion scientists, published several papers in which he says that this work is a coordination of 8 scientific teams working over 30 years in Russia to produce this work. We wouldn't really have access to it except that it came out in the early 90s with Glasnost and Perestroika, when the Russian government allowed its client states in Eastern Europe to be released and to become independent. The Berlin Wall came down at the same time, and a free programming stopped, the restrictions against publishing stopped, and the torsion work became public. Well, what is this energy? This is Claude, who discovered this energy in the 50s. And he calls it energy of time. It's involved with a flow of time which can change. If you go back to the wonderful books like he discovered behind the Iron Curtain by Ostrander Schroeder, they have an entire chapter in which they interview Nikolai Kozlov. And he takes them into their laboratory and does experiments for them, and you can find out there, sort of more or less firsthand, what it's like. Kozlov was watching double star systems, stars that are binary in order to one another, and he noticed that there was an effect happening that he could not explain by normal physics, that one star was influencing the other in a way that didn't really make sense by normal stellar physics. And he really came to the conclusion that it must be that the one that's burning faster is affecting time in a different way, and that led him to his theory. Their proposal is that every elementary particle, electrons, protons, neutrons, have spin. They're all spinning like the tops or like the Earth is spinning. Every time the spin direction changes, that produces one of these torsion waves. It's sort of like a ripple in the fabric of space-time that travels out, that carries that twist with it, that conserves angular momentum. And it's kind of needed to make the whole system hang together. And that's what a torsion wave really is. It occurs a lot. It's present all the time. We're always producing torsion waves, but they're weaker than electromagnetism by 6 or 7 orders of magnitude, so we don't normally see the effects. But when you have a Tesla coil or something that's making high frequency, high voltage oscillations, it's causing electrons to go back and forth very rapidly. You're also producing torsion waves. So they may be more responsible for some of the healing devices than the electromagnetic field itself. So that's one of the big questions for people to look at. What the Russians say is that at the smallest scales, down to the atomic scale, the scale of atoms and electrons, and even smaller, these torsion waves sort of form the fundamental fabric of space-time. They're really probably they make a bigger component of zero-point energy than photons do. And if you want to understand what's happening at very small scales, you have to include these torsion waves. They kind of weave together in a sense to make a fabric of space-time. And if you want to move in space-time and you change the torsion, you change the physical effects that result from it. One way of thinking about it is if you're a little particle and you're being bombarded in space by photons and other forces in all directions, you slip around, you get knocked back and forth, in what's called a random walk, or consider a Vega, a random walk. And that's what a particle looks like at very small scales in normal physics. And that's around the particle, there is a set of waves of energy from this interaction. But when you change something, when you undergo what they call an irreversible process, if you have, for example, a bottle of gas, and you open the cap and the gas comes out and expands, that's an irreversible process. You can't get it back into the bottle. The physicists would say entropy just increased. The randomness increased, the order decreased, and what the Russians find is when that happens, torsion gets produced. These little processes of equilibrium go out of equilibrium, and torsion gets produced. Another way of talking about torsion is to say, go back to Einstein's picture, where he would say that it's the curvature of space-time that we use to describe forces. What he left out of his picture is torsion. Einstein has a curving space-time, but there's a twist that's also present as well as the curvature. When you put in a twist, you have a new effect that was left out. It changes the physics. It changes the results. There are physicists in Russia, such as Shipov, who've worked out very detailed equations, published books about this theory. One of the other torsion scientists has said that this theory works very well for describing torsion. So it's a well-developed theory within certain groups in Russia. What's the proof that this really happens? Here are some statements about Russian experimental particle physicists. I'm not going to go over them here, but there are a bunch of high-energy particle physics experiments that appear to verify that torsion is real and does happen. Experiments that Kozelek and his colleagues did in the laboratory are sort of illustrated here. You have a bell jar, or an inverted glass jar, inside of a thread, holding a horizontal bar with a wig on one end, or a long mass. It's called a torsion tension. What it's found is that a process which is irreversible, where entropy is changing, entropy is increasing or decreasing, will affect the motion of this torsion tension. If you have a process illustrated here, take an acetone, take a cotton straw, give it an acetone, let the acetone evaporate. That is a process where entropy is increasing. Put that on the outside of the bell jar, near this pendulum, and he finds that it pushes away the long end of the pendulum. It's a repulsion. Take another process where entropy is decreasing, and put that outside the bell jar. It has the opposite effect. It pulls the tip of the pendulum toward the process. So there's two different types of effects. One that pushes away, one that pulls toward, based on the sign of entropy, whether entropy is increasing or decreasing. They also found that if you take the same process in a different kind of pendulum that's perfectly round, a circular plate suspended in the middle of a string, and put the object of the process up at the top, something travels down the string and causes the plate to rotate. If it's a entropy increasing process like acetone evaporation, the plate rotates to the right. Opposite goes to the left, or entropy decreasing process. So these two different forms of twist, left and right-handed torsion, come out of the experiments. So they call the right-handed torsion. One left-handed, increasing entropy causes right-handed, decreasing causes left. The increasing entropy right-handed causes repulsion, pushes things away. Decreasing entropy left-handed pulls things toward. If two different polarities, these two effects, it sounds kind of like yin and yang from Chinese medicine. It's the same effect. It also sounds like dark matter and dark energy. It's the quality of space that astronomers are seeing in distant galaxies, either things are being pulled toward more than they're supposed to by this gravity, or they're being pushed away. And it's not part of our Western physics, but it becomes very naturally out of the Russian torsion research. Here's some processes that in which entropy is increasing, and there is a right-handed torsion, evaporating acetone, a dying plant, melting ice, chemical reactions, or sugar dissolving. Processes that decrease entropy, produce left-handed. Here's some examples: a stretching rubber band, a growing healthy plant, ice freezing, or a compressed spring. Most of the time, by this model, these two different types of torsion are more or less in balance, they're more or less equal. So our normal space-time, our normal experience, we see what happens when these two are roughly equal. A little bit more right-handed and left-handed, but they're roughly equal, so we don't see these effects. But when you produce a whole lot more of one type or the other, you start to get unusual physical effects. I believe this is the torsion equivalent of what Bill Tiller calls raising the gauge. You're pushing things away from the normal condition of balance, and when you do, you see unusual physical effects. These torsion waves interact with each other. They're coupled to each other, and you can produce from them more complex structures. They twist among each other, and I believe the Russians say this, that is what produces the chakras. That's what produces the aura around us. That's the nature of subtle energy, of orbs, of other structures that have a permanence to them, that can survive and hold together. In our Western physics, electromagnetism can't do that. You take a bunch of microwaves in the microwave oven, and open the door, they come flying out. They don't hold together, they don't produce structures. But torsion is different. Torsion has the possibility of producing structures. It has some other unusual effects. The Russians find that this energy also can change mass and change density. And here's a quick experiment showing how they do this. They verify these things. And here are some results showing that you can increase the mass or decrease the mass and increase or decrease the density of objects with the torsion radiation. An independent confirmation of this has come from German researcher Fulkammer, who calls it something different, has a different theory for it, which is not unusual in terms of this substance. But he finds that you can have a chemical process which is totally sealed and contained hermetically, and which the mass inside the container changes after the process is finished. Very, very careful, precise measurements. Other experiments by Sydney and others have found that the biological systems, like growing worms, for example, inside hermetically sealed containers, when you kill the worms, there is a change in the mass of the container, and there's no way for any conventional energy to get in or out, but the mass changes. There's a life energy, that this force is essential to the life energy. When the life energy changes, the weight of the object changes. You probably heard about old experiments that were done 100 years ago with people at the time of death, where first on a scale, at the time of death, there'd be a sudden change of a half ounce or so in the body, which the form of energy is not anything physical. Once again, this energy is the soul leaving the body, is how it's described. And it's very similar to what is being seen in these experiments. So again, it goes back to this energy which affects mass, changes measured mass. Other dramatic and revolutionary experiments that Russians have done involve doing astronomy with this energy. You can design detectors with very special kind in a parabolic reflector and cover the opening of the reflector with shields so that conventional kinds of energy can't get in. And you can then do astronomy, sweep it across the sky, or let objects like the sun go in front of it, and they're able to measure the effect of the sun. And they see the sun, but they see it a little bit differently than you'd expect from conventional astronomy. They get not one peak of energy or three. They get a peak in the middle, which corresponds to the instantaneous position of the sun. It corresponds to where the sun will appear if there's no time delay between the sun's location and ours. Normally we look in the sky and see the sun where it was 8.3 minutes ago. It takes that awful light to get from there to here. But they actually get that peak. They get a peak at the instantaneous point. They also get a third peak where the sun will be 8.3 minutes in the future, which actually turns out to be the same as where the sun will be if light traveled backwards in time from us to the sun. So as if they're seeing three different kinds of energy with these measurements. He says torsion operates very differently than electromagnetism. However, so here will be a sketch of the three positions of the sun based on protection. The exciting thing about this, though, is that if you want to try to understand a psychic phenomenon or paranormal phenomenon, then you need something like this, because there are lots of examples where signals are not limited to the speed of light. There have been experiments done where people are wired up to the acupuncture system, for example, while measurements of the voltage on acupoints are being measured. When a solar flare occurs, they often see an instantaneous pulse On the active emission at the moment for the sun is 8.3 minutes before any electromagnetic signal we get here from the sun. So this is the type of thing you start to find when you start looking at the torsion technology. This ability of things to travel backwards in time and faster than light is very similar to what Taylor was talking about yesterday in terms of these deltrons. He was saying that's a property you need for deltrons to be able to calculate some of the psychic effects that he sees. Well, it may well be that torsion already provides exactly that behavior. If you have an energy of this type, then you can do something very unusual with it that you normally can't do. You can do holography, you can add waves together, but you can send waves into the future and in the past. Or you can send them into the future with the reflections to come back to you. But if you wait for conventional light, you send a light beam off into the future, the Alpha Centauri, and wait for something to reflect there and come back to you, it'll take a very long time. It takes 4 years to go out and 4 years to go back. So you don't get the reflection until 8 years later. But if you're sending these photons, these torsion waves, off into space, say, very, very far from the distant matter of the universe, which will take 10 billion years to travel all that matter, and then the reflection comes back. But suppose it comes back and it goes backward in time, traveling waves. It would get back to you at the moment that you sent out the first wave. So the round trip would be something very close to zero.
Right. Cancel each other out.
So that might twist up your head for a little while.
No.
It turns out Richard Feynman and John Wheeler proposed something like this back in the 40s in terms of light waves. They were looking at experimental theories that would involve things that behave that way, and get some really remarkable and quite beautiful aspects to it. And so the last chapter of my book I talk about some of these things. I don't want to twist your mind anymore at the moment, but here's some of the data from the Russians who are astronomy, looking out into space. You can see not just the sun, but also just the galaxies. You can measure things about them that you couldn't normally measure. There are patents and other applications that I mentioned, the signal generators using torsion. Here's a little device called Comfort M, which is a spinning magnet that's produced in Russia. Experiments have been done with this device. Here's just the Comfort M at the top of the experiment here. In the middle, there was a dish of alcohol. At the bottom, a dish of distilled water. This was done by Boyd and published. They find that if you let this little thing run for a while, producing torsion waves, they go through the alcohol and get absorbed by the water. After a while, the water starts to take on the properties of the alcohol. It starts to taste like the alcohol and to have mild immediate effects. Even though chemically, it's still pure. So it's transferring something from the alcohol to the water. The Russians believe this is the spin pattern that's being transferred. It has biologically the same effect as the alcohol does. This may well be the secret to homeopathy. The Russian scientists talk about a theory, which is the property of the spin patterns in the water that carry the biological effect. And that's what homeopathy transfers to water, and that's why it has effectiveness, even though it's still chemically pure water. And it appears as though these little torsion generators pick up that same energy and transfer it to the water in this kind of experiment. These little generators are also been used to affect very large masses of seismograph type barbells that respond, and they also can be caused to twist even through shielding by the little generators. Here's some data from those experiments. Thompson University did an extensive 10-year program with torsion. They found that with high-speed gyros, you can cause laser beams to bend, which is a purely torsion effect. Radiometers are affected by torsion devices, and even time, the flowing of time, has been changed. Chernobyl and other experiments, we have a whole bunch of those torsion generators, all producing one polarity of torsion waves, send them into a spherical container, and they develop a concentration of torsion of one side or the other in that container, they can actually cause watches, clocks to slow down and speed up in a controlled way. So they're actually changing over time. They've used torsion generators to affect metallurgy. This is some examples of crystallization. When a metal, a molten metal is cooling, the way it forms crystals depends on many things, and torsion is one of the things that can change how the crystals form. There are some medical devices that claim to be using torsion, and there are probably lots of applications of healing with this energy, according to the Russians. As you know, our cells are producing biophotons all the time, and according to the German researcher Pop, there's a coherence that's developed because these biophotons pass through many cells, not just one. They have a mean-free path which goes through many cells, so there's a coherence to some of these patterns. This may provide a way of understanding how the biofield becomes coherent. This is a proposed model. We have inside our body, we have cells with biophotons that are produced by the DNA, but according to the Russian work, they're also producing torsion waves that have much more penetrating power than biophotons. They aren't stopped by the flesh, by the tissue in the same way. So that while we may have coherent patterns of biophotons in the body, that same coherent pattern in the torsion energy will extend well beyond the body. And that would be a model for what the aura really is. That we can measure electromagnetically some of the properties of the aura, it may well be because the aura is made of torsion. And that could explain why the picture would be that inside the body you have a coherent pattern of biophoton energy, but outside the body we have a coherent pattern of torsion energy as well. And there's very little energy involved in the torsion pattern. So we have experiments where people have been able to do energy healing over large distances. There seems to be no limit to how many miles you can affect someone using energy healing. But that will be an electromagnetic process with the power requirements to be able to get photons over 10,000 miles would be enormous. But if you're trying to send torsion waves over that same distance, it can be very small. And one possible explanation for how it's possible to... Sorry.
We've got 10 minutes.
What?
You're at 10 minutes.
Oh, we're fine. We're almost there. One of the keys, I think, to understanding how it's possible to focus healing energy so precisely over very large distances. And we saw a while ago how Master Lee was able to do that from California to Pennsylvania in these little petri dishes. But healers typically, when they're doing their work, you often get a holographic image of the person you're working with. They can actually see in their mind's eye the organ, the state of the body, things like that. They're coupling the holographic process that is very difficult to explain based on conventional electromagnetism. But if it really is a coupled holographic process involving torsion waves, then you can see how it's possible. And this little diagram, which I explain in more detail in the book, basically involves the healer sending out energy, torsion waves, into the future and into the past. And it gets reflected by the rest of the matter of the universe in both cases. And that may sound like a very daunting process because it's a long way. But eventually it gets reflected when it goes out. And we'll talk more about this in the question and answer period. But it makes it possible for that energy to be reflected, returned into a coherent image somewhere else, in another place, another time. And because this travels such a large distance, the distance between the person and the healer is not important. It explains how it's possible to bring some data to show that the effect is not weakened with distance. does not reach with time offset because of this holographic four-dimensional process that occurs with torsion. And I apologize if it's a lot to say in a short time. The book explains it in more detail, but I think I'll just kind of skip over this at the moment. A lot of these processes are very consistent with what we know about how particles behave at very small scales. But at these small scales, every elementary particle that appears to be sitting still is really undergoing this dance, this very rapid motion back and forth. It's called a Zitterbewegung in the German, and it interacts with the zero-point energy of the vacuum all around it. It's being hit and bombarded by the energy of the zero point, and it's also radiating energy from the zero point. So our conventional Western physics view, the quantum picture, would say, oh, it's just sitting there. It's in the ground state. The atoms are sitting there, the particles are sitting there in the ground state. Nothing's happening. But at the microscopic picture, a whole lot's happening. It's really interacting at a furious rate with the zero-point energy of the vacuum, emitting and absorbing energy. There are some physicists, such as Hal Puthoff, Ernie Hirsch, Carlos Rueda, who are interested in psychic phenomena, paranormal phenomena. They know that these things occur. They know that our present quantum picture is missing something. They have to go a little deeper, go into that level where all those activities happen. Don't just ignore it, but include it. And I think that's the key to understanding why it is that psychic phenomena so far are not really being well understood by Western physics, because they haven't gone into that very small scale, high energy, rapid process that occurs at a very small scale. That's where the torsion interaction is really important. And that's down at the small scale below the size of the Higgs boson, down where the fabric of space is really being determined. And if you want to cause dramatic physical effect, as we work with space-time, slowing down time, other processes, that's how you do it. That can explain orbs, chakras, and even the Akashic record. Here's a nice little record of orb given by a friend of mine on one of our expeditions, about 3 feet in diameter. Here's a person time of death. Orbs, hospice workers often observe these things leaving the body at time of death. These are structures that are made of something that we don't know what it is. It's not electromagnetism. It could reflect light. It was electromagnetic. It's not gravity. It's something else. And these structures have a permanence to them. Orbs hold together. They often interact in a conscious way with people. So what are they? What's the soul? How is it managed to survive from lifetime to lifetime? We have these energy forms that exist in higher dimensions that are not part of Western physics. And I think torsion offers a way to explain it. Here's the Akashic record, illustrated very schematically. People do past life regressions. We're able to be hypnotized and remember things that happened to us thousands or millions of years ago. We have a reality and an immediacy to those memories. They're recorded somewhere, as we've talked about for thousands of years in the Hindu tradition and elsewhere. So there's a way for these events to be recorded in space-time. Torsion offers a way to understand the medium on which those are recorded. Here's 2 little fish. They're swimming around in the water, but they can't see anything. The water's clear. So they say, what's this about zero-point energy and subtle energy? And I don't see anything. The space is empty. The vacuum is empty. There's nothing there. But in fact, there is something there. And if you look on the final scale, then you have physical effects. You spin the water around in a whirlpool, and all of a sudden, it has a different feel. So I think the torsion is like that. And if there's a pattern, if instead of being random, the energy has a pattern to it, then there can be physical effects you can actually see and measure. And one experimental verification of this idea was done by Garaya and Maponen a few years ago. They had a little container of DNA in a high vacuum chamber. They zapped with a laser, and they found that they took it out again, and there was something in the vacuum, empty space, chamber, Now it wasn't the way it was before. Now it reflected light, even though it was supposed to be empty. And they made this energy form. Apparently, it's probably one of the first laboratory productions of thought. It's a form of energy that does not correspond to matter. It's what Voltaire would call an excited ground state. That's what they call it, an excited ground state. It's vacuum, but it's not energy. It's something different. So this is an example of what you start getting when you look into these energy forms. And anyway, so I will leave it there. I have a little picture in the back of my book showing how we can go. There's a hierarchy. You go from the basic physical dimension up to the higher spiritual planes with these various steps. That's what we're heading towards, understanding how to make that bridge. So, and I'll just start with Victor Hugo's quote, "All the armies of the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time is coming."
Either projection or the movement of entities during the healing process that show up during addictions.
You asked about entities that show up in the healing process?
Through addiction. Has there been any research done on documentation with this theory concerning entities?
I don't know. I don't know. Usually people who are doing energy removal or soul repair, things like that, are not working with these devices. So we're in a very early stage of trying to do that. Certainly I think the photography was talked about yesterday in terms of using illuminated. Those are probably examples where we're seeing the torsion field changing, where we're getting other dimensions coming in, other energies coming in, and they're showing up. But as far as a systematic process, and having been working with the physicists, that hasn't happened yet. I think we're beginning to start.
It's dark energy, dark matter through time and space that is then released. And so this would be a very interesting method.
Yeah, and it might be that when people call that dark energy, dark matter in terms of the theory, the spirit energies, that might be something different than what the physicists are talking about, because they're talking about something that has a gravitational effect to it. It might not be the same. It sounds the same. It might be
just answering your question, there is an institute out in Walnut Creek. I take classes up there and take the spirit releasement. And it was amazing because the director actually put the person in deep hypnosis, which is just mandalas, and it was fascinating because it was a psychology where she worked with the spirit to try to get it to go to the light. But it was such a psychology because she made sure the person and the spirit, because it was a codependent relationship, and once they both agreed to leave the body, then it moved on and the girl was cleared. So there is that kind of work done at that institute. And I would also want to say two more things real quick. You might have heard of this story, but it was back in the 1960s Cold War, a guy named Vern Cameron, and he was doing a little map dowser, and he had accurately dowsed the location of every Russian submarine in the entire fleet and the United States Navy too. Every location in the CIA determined him to be a national security risk and midland for the country.
I don't doubt it. I've heard that, something like that. Some of the stuff, the versions we're getting out, lots of earlier cases that happened before it was in there. So we're starting out a little bit.
So, if we include the mathematics of torsion fields together with the conventional fields of physics, does that help us address the hard problem of how a creative consciousness can interact with that?
Yes. You want more? I think it does. I think that our DNA is a very unusual double helix structure, and I believe that a lot of the process going on in the DNA are engaging these torsion fields as well. So some of the experiments that Ryan has been doing where he's applying various types of non-conventional or non-energetic, non-electromagnetic energies to DNA are showing effects on the DNA from them. I think it probably works both ways. The DNA probably creates these fields too. And so that's maybe one of the secrets to how we're able to both communicate psychically and also to exert cyberkinetic ability on other physical systems. Because we, through our torsion field, through our aura, we create a pattern of that energy that has an effect on them. So I think that's one of the things that we need to learn a whole lot more about, but I believe that's one of the keys. Typically, as you know, you want to go into a psychic state, a coherent state of consciousness where you have your molecules that are working together, your currents working together, your physical processes working together. So they all then create a torsion field